Hey everyone, welcome to our webinar for DOE Energy Innovator Fellows. Today, our topic is utility rate making and rate design, and we have a real expert with us, so you're in for a treat. Pete Kappers is a staff scientist and strategic advisor in Berkeley Lab's Energy Markets and Planning Department. He's been at the department for 25 years. He's done a lot of research and technical assistance to states across the country on utility regulatory and business models, pricing and rate design, demand response, and energy efficiency. He's an economist, so please roll up your sleeves and ask him your questions in the chat box at any time, or feel free to raise your hand um, during his presentation or during Q&A at the end to ask a question live, and then we'll call on you in that case to unmute yourself. Just a quick reminder that we have several other great webinars coming up. The next one is about sort of the fundamentals of the power system, regulation and market structure. Then we focus on distribution system operations as opposed to planning, which we've covered in the past. So this one will be really great. And electricity markets, Pete Kappers will be back for that, talking about how market design, how markets operate. And then we have a deep dive on distribution operations with respect to distributed energy resources and tariff provisions that can enable distributed resources to actually provide grid services in a way that's helpful for the system. And then we'll wrap the series for this year in sometime probably in August with a stakeholder engagement session where we have peer sharing breakouts and you can all share with each other what you're doing, but we'll also give you an update on all of the latest practices with respect to stakeholder engagement in distribution system planning around the country. All right, Pete, up to you.
All right. Great. Thank you, Lisa.
You have to be able to stop
Okay.
sharing.
Can everyone see my screen, hopefully? Lisa, can you see it?
Yes.
All right, great. Thank you. Really appreciate the introduction, Lisa. Excited to be talking to all of you today about, I actually find a very interesting topic, utility rate making and rate design. I'm going to talk for about an hour or so, which when I say that sounds really long. I hope it's interesting. I'm trying to make this dynamic and exciting for all of you. But to break things up, if you have questions as we move through any of the material, feel free to raise your hand, put a question into the chat. I have several screens up. I can see the chat. I can see everybody's pictures as well as my own notes and things. So I will do my best to just kind of stop and answer questions as they arise. I also know in a virtual environment, that's not always something people feel comfortable with. So if you want to, feel free to just keep your questions to the end and we can deal with them in the last half hour or so, or however long folks want to stick around for. Okay, so with that, let's get going. So basic first principles here. Utilities are monopoly providers of electricity. Okay, so that means they have an obligation to serve all customers within their service territory. They have exclusive franchise rights, as it's called, which means they are the only ones within their service territory that have the ability to actually provide electricity, deliver electricity to customers in that service territory. They can't move outside. They can't provide and deliver electricity to folks outside and nobody else can come in. But the other thing that they are responsible for is to provide that electricity at just and reasonable rates. And they're going to do that within the context of what's called a general rate case. It's a formal or contested or litigated proceeding that is ultimately intended to establish the rates utilities can charge customers. Now, regulatory agencies, they are the economic agents that basically act like a market. They get to determine what is an appropriate rate to set for this electric service that's out there. And so typically the approach that's going to be taking, the method that is going to be taking is cost of service rate making. And so I'm going to spend a lot of time over the next several slides, probably at least half of the time today, really just going over all the basic elements of cost of service rate making. And so regulators ultimately have to, they got to step in and enforce economic efficiency or ensure that the price set for electricity is just right in the parlance of the three bears. So their job, among other things, is really to approve rates that the electric utility can charge for its services. Those rates have to be reflective of the costs incurred to serve the utility's customers. Now, the regulator must deem which of those costs have been prudently incurred. Appropriately incurred is another word, sort of synonym with prudent. The regulator must assess which of the utility's assets are considered used and useful in service of customers. These are all terms you will hear commonly used in the rate making space. And thus, the utility warrants recovery of those costs from ratepayers, inclusive of some allowed rate of return. The regulator must then deem whether or not the rates that the utility is proposing are fair and reasonable. I'll talk a little bit more about that. And then lastly, the regulators have to assess whether they will allow the utility with what is a reasonable opportunity. They have to give the utility an opportunity with the rates that are being set to recover all of those costs and earn a fair rate of return on capital that's invested. So it's really important to understand that last part. It is the ability or the opportunity to fully recover, not being authorized or guaranteed full recovery. Okay, so in the process of cost of service rate making, there are really three questions that we seek to answer, or we seek answers to. First is, how much revenue should the utility be allowed to collect? How much of the total revenue should be collected from each class of customers? And then the last question is, how much of the class's revenue should be collected from each customer? So we're going to deal with these in order. And so the first question is typically asked by developing a revenue requirement as part of a cost of service study. And so the annual revenue requirement, I want you to think of the annual revenue requirement as a pie. And this pie represents all of the utility's costs that it's incurred over the course of a year in order to provide customers with safe, reliable, and ultimately, hopefully, affordable electric service. Now, we define that revenue requirement over some contiguous 12-month period, typically called a test year. That can either be historical, looking backwards, or it can even be forward-looking and literally forecast things out a year in advance, or maybe even 2 years, depending on what time period we're looking for. So when we think about the revenue requirement, let's talk about the pieces or the components that ultimately comprise that. Well, the largest category of costs comes from the utility's operations and maintenance efforts. Expenses associated with generating electricity, maintaining the distribution system, and paying the utilities workers are all ultimately included in this category. Now, the next two categories of expenses relate to utility investments in physical assets. Utilities are allowed to recover all of the costs associated with those investments. Importantly, a regulator has deemed to be used and useful in service to the utility's customers. Used meaning it's in operation, useful meaning it's actually helpful for them, and it's a two-part test. And this ultimately allows the utility to include those investment costs in what's called its rate base, and that then is what becomes eligible for recovery from ratepayers. Now, on the one hand, utilities are able to recover the amount of money spent procuring the capital asset. You oftentimes hear this referred to as the return of a utility's capital investment, or as it's more commonly known, it's depreciation expense. Now, in simplest terms, depreciation is the equal apportionment of an asset's investment cost over the useful lifetime of that asset. However, more complex approaches can and frequently are taken for a variety of different reasons. But if you remember your fundamentals in economics class, there is a time value of money. Someone's capital is being tied up in this asset, as the utility typically doesn't pay cash for them. Instead, they have to repay financiers over the asset's lifetime. And so those entities who have lent the utility money, they have to be compensated accordingly. Now, this is commonly referred to as the return on a utility's capital investments, which goes to both debt holders in the form of interest payments and shareholders to the degree to which they even exist. Regulators allow the utility to include the interest payments associated with those rate-based assets that go to bondholders, but they also authorize the level of return to shareholders that again is deemed fair and reasonable. And then the last category of the revenue requirement captures any state, territorial, or federal income taxes, again, to the degree to which they're even applicable. So utilities ultimately need ample support for their proposed rates that provide a clear and transparent process for identifying the utility's costs of serving customers. Such a cost of service study, as it's typically called, usually acts as the basis for the utility's efforts to develop updated rate proposals for regulators to consider. A cost of service study typically includes three elements, and we'll cover them now. First, it derives the total amount of revenue the utility would be required to collect to fully cover its authorized cost. This is the revenue requirement. And so that represents the annual cost of serving all of the utility's customers. All right, so at this point, we've asked and answered the first question in rate making. Second question then says, well, now we need to understand of that total revenue requirement, how much should we collect of that from each class? Well, this is now where the notion of cost allocation comes in, and we use that to determine how much of that revenue we need to collect from each of our classes. So in our pie analogy, let's think again that revenue requirement is the total pie. And if the goal is to ensure that each class pays the utility for the costs they cause the utility to incur when taking electric service, well, then the class is going to get its slice of the revenue requirement pie. And that represents the cost that it has caused the utility to incur on that class's behalf. So first, what we're going to do is take all of that revenue requirement, and we're going to first assign each of the utilities' costs into major functional groups. We want to ultimately understand what is really causing, what is that cost for? Ultimately, one of the reasons we want to do that is because if we understand what it is for, then we can better understand what may drive that cost. And then we can ultimately decide, based on that driver, how we're going to allocate or assign that cost for recovery from the rate from the customer class. We may also want to do this for totally other reasons, like unbundling rates, better, providing greater transparency to our customers around what the rate is for transmission, let's say, versus what the rate is for generation or electricity production versus what the electricity rate is for distribution, as just one other example of why you would want to go through this functionalization stage. So typically we think of the main functions as generation, transmission, distribution, and then I've categorized just an other category. In other, there are technically a few subcategories, at least I believe from a FERC Form 1 accounting standard, but for our purposes, let's just keep it simple and say generation, transmission, distribution, and other. So once we've been able to functionalize all of those costs, well, now we need to classify what is the key driver of those functionalized costs? Well, electricity-driven costs are going to vary with the volume of electricity consumed on a kWh, megawatt hour basis. Demand-driven costs are going to vary with the volume of maximum demand, and we can define that in a bunch of different ways. And then lastly, we have customer-driven costs that vary with the number of customers served. I see Lisa asked a question. What are the implications for customer cost of reducing or extending depreciation periods for a given asset? That was from a couple slides ago. Quick answer to that one is it either makes the annual depreciation expense larger or smaller is the first thing, which means its contributions to rates will be larger or smaller. If you accelerate the depreciation schedule, let's say the asset typically has a 20-year lifetime, but you cut that in half. Well, now you got to collect all of that money over 10 years instead of over 20 years, right? So the amount that goes into rates is going to be larger. But on the flip side, if you are now, paying off that asset in 10 years instead of 20 years, well, there's an interest payment that conceivably you're going to be saving from, let's say, a debt service cost standpoint. So there is an offset. What that exact offset looks like is really dependent on the debt service cost relative to the, what you're saving versus on the flip side, how much additional money you have to collect from a depreciation standpoint to expedite it. So it is a little bit of a balancing act, and it can be, you can use math to sort of figure out what that net looks like. Okay, back to classification. So like I said, you've got these three key drivers: electricity, demand, and then just customers. Notionally, just being a customer, there are certain things that are costs are going to be driven just by simply being a customer. So if we take a high level assessment of our functionalized costs, we can think about generation as like, well, the production of energy or electricity, excuse me, is going to be clearly driven by energy, right? The more energy, the more production costs we have. The less energy demanded, the less production costs we have. But we also know that there are either capacity costs if you happen to be in an organized wholesale market, or just investment in generation if the utility owns it, is going to be predicated on demand, planned demand down the road. So there are clearly some of the more capital intensive costs, capital related costs that are really driven by demand. Transmission side, largely going to be driven by demand, but there may be some instances or certain small subsets of costs where there may be energy driven costs as well. On the distribution side, similar to transmission, heavy on the demand side, right? We size the distribution system based on the maximum demand for electricity, substations, transformers, all of that stuff. But there are certainly components of the distribution system, like a service drop, that it doesn't matter how much electricity you consume, what your maximum demand is, every customer gets their own service drop. So every customer gets their own meter. Two potential examples there of sort of why there may be some customer-driven distribution costs. And then on the other side, just simply being a customer means we need to have a call center, right? Doesn't matter how much volume of electricity, what your demand is, you're going to need a call center just like your neighbor might. So these are real customer-driven costs that typically fall in that other category. And so once we've now been able to identify the key driver, well, now we have a basis for ultimately determining how to allocate those costs or assign them to each class by their share of the main cost driver. So in this last example, we think of energy-related, energy-driven generation costs. How are we going to allocate those out to the residential, commercial, large power, and street lighting as just 4 example customer classes? Well, we could do it based on the share or the they're each of their share of annual energy, right? Well, the only thing is we do know that the cost to produce electricity does vary by time, right? Cost of electricity, it's 5 o'clock on a summer afternoon, is very different than the cost to produce electricity at 5 a.m. on a spring morning. And so we may want to better represent those differences in cost by allocating not based on just annual energy, but maybe some factor that is more tied into time. But if we want to do that, then we may need to ultimately functionalize and I'm just forgetting my words now, functionalize and classify those costs on a temporal basis so we can then allocate them appropriately. So you see how these steps are in some respects driven by kind of the end result of how we want to allocate, but we need to make sure working backwards, we've stored those costs and saved us those costs in a very particular way. Just going to say the quiet part out loud. If Pete is presenting, especially lecture on Mary more than industry, and you must benefit from this training. Thank you, CP. I appreciate the call out. So ultimately, we're going to take the revenue requirement and we're going to figure out how to allocate it out to in this case, our 4 major customer classes. Again, typical utility has far more than 4 of them, but we're keeping it simple here. Okay, so last, we now need to determine how much of that class's revenue should be collected from each and every customer. And this is where rate design comes in. This is what we use to ultimately decide how we're going to collect all of that revenue from all of the customers in the class. And so what we're really saying in our pie analogy is how much of the pie does each individual customer in the class get? That's what rate design ultimately does. And so, although approved retail rates, they have to fully recover utilities costs, the allocated revenue requirement to the class. They have to be deemed just and reasonable by regulators, and there's a sliding scale there, and regulators have a lot of ability to sort of determine what they view as just and reasonable. There are certainly some criteria around that we'll get to in a second. There's also a second set of considerations that comes into play when designing rates. These rates need to satisfy these rates may need to satisfy certain policy or market objectives that can vary based on a state's distinct priorities, as represented by their rules, their regulations, and their policies, as well as stakeholder motivations. Others can be brought into the regulatory proceedings, propose different objectives that may not necessarily be on the may not be regulators' objectives, but they may take them and ask the utility to ensure rate design sort of captures that. And so these concepts are applied in tandem to determine both the type, design, and amount of each retail rate component. All right, so to that end, there are a set of principles that are commonly employed by regulators that ensure rates are properly designed, and we call those Bond-Bright principles. These principles include a rate design that is reasonably easy for the average customer to understand and for the utility to ultimately implement. It should both ensure the utility sufficiently and fairly collects the appropriate level of revenue from its customers, and in the process avoids inappropriately discriminating against certain customers. Now, while the first two steps in cost of service rate making that I discussed previously, they're pretty empirical, right? You can just use mathematical formula to ultimately go down that path, use accounting principles. This final step oftentimes allows the utility to employ more art than science when designing customer class level rates. So let me give you an example. Suppose a regulator has a policy goal of promoting economic efficiency. The resulting rate could consist of a very complex set of charges that truly reflect the marginal cost of the utility, but only the savviest of customers can actually understand. If the rate employed an opt-in or a voluntary enrollment approach, well, then it's likely only a handful of customers would want to and voluntarily take service under it, thereby undermining the regulator's intent of more broadly achieving economic efficiency. So the utility might instead decide to design the rate more simply, while still attempting to convey a more limited subset of information to customers about the marginal cost to serve electricity through, say, a basic time of use rate. We'll get into what that rate design looks like in a second, but such rate designs have been shown to be attractive to customers, provided they're marketed well. Something else we're actually going to touch on during the talk in a little bit. The end result would likely be more customers facing modestly more economically efficient rates than very few customers facing a highly economically efficient rate. Okay, so let's delve a little deeper into the rate components that comprise a typical retail rate. Generally speaking, there are three types of rate components that most often are considered when designing rates. First and foremost, one I'm sure everybody is intimately aware of is the volumetric energy rate, right? This is typically a cents per kilowatt hour. Ideally, the cost to produce and deliver a unit of electricity are perfectly recovered by the designed energy charge. However, volumetric energy charges are the bill components that are most responsive to changes in a customer's electricity consumption. Thus, there are often policy preferences to make the volumetric energy charge higher to, for example, promote investments in energy efficiency. This might explain why there has been a heavy reliance historically on volumetric energy charges to recover a utilities costs, especially in the residential sector, as it really improves the business case for energy efficiency investments. Now, in contrast, high volumetric energy charges actually work against the adoption of electric vehicles, as they would increase the cost of operation. So you can see how that art and science comes into play in thinking about how one might design the volumetric energy charge to achieve different policy outcomes, and they may even, run counter to one another. So aside from just a flat volumetric energy rate, you can differentiate by the quantity of electricity that's consumed. We can do that in an inclining basis where it represents sort of basic element, economic theory that would suggest the more of something you consume, the higher up the supply curve you're going to go, and therefore the more expensive it's going to be inframarginally. And so we might have a rate as designed on the left-hand side that says as a customer moves up in their total monthly consumption, they are going to be charged incrementally more with each successive block. Alternatively, we could go the opposite direction and think of it like BJ's or Costco, where the notion is if you buy in bulk, we will give you a discount. And so here we're going the exact opposite direction, where we start with the highest price for the lowest block of energy and then slowly, work our way to lower and lower prices as we move to higher and higher blocks of energy over the course of the month. Now, we can also differentiate by time. I mentioned a time of use rate. So a time of use rate is a very simple, think of it like a matinee pricing for electricity, right? We all know about the matinee, middle of the day, least number of people are going to the movie theater, and so it's the cheapest. Versus 7 o'clock on a Friday evening, it's the biggest demand for going to a movie. Movie theaters are typically going to charge the most at that time. And so it's the same concept here in electricity pricing is we would typically set the highest price, the peak price, at the point in which the cost is going to be the highest and or the demand for electricity is going to be the greatest. And then all the other hours would fall into the off-peak. Now, that is typically going to be a static rate. It may not change over the course of the entire year. The definition of the peak and off-peak period may always be the same. The charge levels themselves may always be the same. Or maybe it's seasonally differentiated. Maybe the definition of the peak stays the same, but the rate changes, or even the definition of the peak and off-peak period can change. But the notion is this peak and off-peak is always going to apply every day, 365 days a year. Now, alternatively, we can think about a rate that really seeks to address episodic issues, whether it's on the reliability side or it's an economic side. And in that case, we're talking about a critical peak pricing rate where every once in a while, we want customers to, let's say, reduce the use of electricity or reflect the fact that electricity is really expensive at very limited times of the year. And so those would be called critical peaks. And so we would episodically call an event and increase the rate dramatically up to 10 or up to 15 or up to 20 times a year. And the utility would announce that and would be clear to everybody what that critical peak price would be. And then we have what I would call a hybrid between them, which is basically instead of a static time of use rate, we actually allow the peak price to the level of the peak price to change every day. Oklahoma Gas and Electric is a perfect example of this. They offer what's called their smart hours rate, and it has four or five rate levels. And basically they announce that rate level a day ahead of time. Customers are aware what tomorrow's peak price will be, and they can plan accordingly. But the utility also has the ability to treat it like a critical peak pricing rate in that in day, if there is some sort of emergency situation where they actually want customers to really reduce electricity, well, they have the ability in day to notify all the customers that actually that peak price is now going to be the critical peak level, the highest level to induce that reduction in demand. And then we have the most economically efficient rate, real-time pricing. 24 individual hourly, a schedule of hourly prices that is typically provided on a day-ahead basis. In some cases, it can even be on a real-time basis. But the notion is you have 24 different hourly prices of electricity that customers are expected to respond to, and that changes, and that is tied typically to organized wholesale power markets, or in cases like Georgia Power, where that doesn't exist, it's going to be based on system lambdas coming out of a day-ahead unit commitment algorithm. Now, last but not least, we could differentiate based on location. And here, typically, we have most utilities have the same price for everyone in their service territory. We're not differentiating by location. There are some places I live in, so I live in upstate New York, National Grid service territory. Their service territory actually spans a number of pricing zones within the New York ISO. And those pricing zones do produce different locational marginal prices, price of electricity, production. And so my supply cost is going to be a little bit different than somebody, let's say, who lives in Albany because of the differences in pricing zones. So That may be one reason for different in bulk power differences across the service territory, even at the bulk power system level. There are, I know in California, they do it based on uh, weather regions, climate regions. Again, more, I think, from differences in part due to cost differences, but also due to allocation factors where they may be just fundamentally different, where a residential customer in one weather zone may be very different than a customer in a different weather part of the service territory. Then you can move down a distribution system. There may be very good reasons for why you would want to price electricity differentially down at the distribution system. One part of the distribution system may be wide open, can accommodate a lot of additional demand, versus another part, maybe not so much. Hosting capacity being a perfect example of sort of what that can look like. And we might want to price electricity differentially to better send economic signals to customers from a usage standpoint. And then last but not least, you could even go so far as to do this at a site-specific level. I'm not aware of any utilities that do this. This is more hypothetical, but it is certainly a possibility at some point in the future. Okay, so that's it for volumetric energy charges. Next up, let's talk about volumetric demand charges. These are typically defined as on a dollar per kW month basis. The demand charge would ideally be designed by a utility to recover fixed or sunk costs driven by infrastructure needs to meet the customer's maximum demand. But in actuality, such rate components are often not applied at all to some customer classes, in particular residential customers. And this is due to the challenges in getting those customers to understand what this charge is and how customers can manage their electricity consumption to mitigate the charge's effects on their monthly bill. So in the context of, let's say, electric vehicles, charging really represents an electric demand intensive activity. This is especially the case with DC fast chargers, and they dramatically increase a customer's instantaneous demand for electricity. So if I, as a residential homeowner, happen to have a rate that includes a demand charge, well, that's going to have some pretty adverse impacts on my willingness to adopt an electric vehicle, because it's going to potentially substantially increase the price for electricity. And then I have to weigh whether that additional cost to use my car, how does that compare now with a fuel price, for example? So rate design can really change the economics of an EV in the context of a demand charge, just as an example. Now, demand charges have a number of different dimensions along which they can be defined. I'm not going to get into each one of these in great detail, but there are whole big long treatises dedicated to literally every single component of these if you really want to delve into it more. Maximum demand is typically measured over some period of time, typically a month, where the level of that demand can be set by each customer independent of other customers. We call that non-coincident peak demand. We can set it when the bulk power system or the distribution system in aggregate reaches its maximum level. That would be coincident peak demand. And then when each customer's maximum demand occurs, maybe during some predefined set of hours, like a peak period each month. The time interval for measuring the maximum demand, well, that can range anywhere from about 15 minutes all the way up to an hour. In addition, the utility could measure demand each month independent of any previous measurements, or they could actually maintain a level of measured demand for some period into the future. And that's, let's say, 12 months. And that takes a longer term view of the notion that demand drives investment. And so we really should be thinking about your contribution over some longer, we might want to think about your contribution to the system peaks over a longer term period than resetting that every single month. And so that's called a demand ratchet. Utility tariffs can also differ in the level of the charge that's applied to that measured demand. The demand charge, again, dollar per kW month, that may be the same all year, or it can actually vary seasonally. Let's say summer versus non-summer months are what you can oftentimes see. And then last but not least is a customer charge. And this is typically a dollar per month fee associated with simply connecting to the grid and engaging with the utility. And so in that regard, it would ideally be designed to perfectly collect all customer-related fixed or sunk costs associated with things like metering, billing, and account management. However, in actuality, it's often set at a lower level due to a myriad of reasons, including equity concerns associated with having a high monthly charge, which is considered regressive for lower income customers. Sticking with our example of rate design applications to EVs, some utilities may want to separately meter the electricity needed to meet EV charging demand relative to what is needed to serve the rest of the premise. Since that additional meter costs money, both to purchase, but also to install and maintain, the customer charge might be higher for a dedicated EV rate design that requires a separate meter rather than, let's say, an EV rate that applies to a whole home. It's just an example. Okay, so the cost of service study basically concludes with the development of these class-specific rate designs that determine how much each customer in the class will be charged for taking electric service from the utility. And like I said, this determines the responsibility of each customer in the class to fairly or to cover their fair share of the utilities costs that were allocated to that class. Now, hopefully you got a better understanding of how the utility ultimately derives the rates that it proposes to customers. However, regulators need not always accept those proposed rates, and in fact may opt to modify them before even approving them. You see, regulators have to balance at least three things when determining how to rule on a utility rate filing in a general rate case. First, they're gonna look at the financial health of the utility and how the requested rate change will affect that health. Cost of service regulation generally has regulators focusing on the near-term impacts of the rate change, but it may also be beneficial for regulators to consider, to the degree possible, the longer-term implications of the rate change on the utility's financial situation. Second, any rate change will inherently have impacts on ratepayers and the bills they pay for electric service in the short run. Now, as with the utility, regulators may also want to understand the longer-term impacts of the requested rate change on customer bills in order to determine how to rule on the utility's requests. And oftentimes, these two considerations do not align, right? What may be great for the utility's financial health may be really bad for ratepayers. My friend CP Smith here from Puerto Rico knows this very well. The utility out there is in bankruptcy. Ratepayers pay a very high price for electricity. They're currently going through a rate request where the utility really needs additional money to cover operating expenses that it is incurring, but that's just going to even increase the cost of electricity even more for ratepayers who predominantly can barely afford the rates they have now and the bills that they're paying now. So this is a clear tension that plays out, I think, everywhere, but to me, Puerto Rico is a sort of poster child example of that. And then last but not least, the rate change may have effects on the achievement of various commission or state policy priorities, or even statutory requirements in some cases. Especially in this case, the longer term impacts on the achievement of these may be positively or negatively impacted by the requested rate change. And thus regulators may want to understand these impacts in both the short and long run while making their decisions. Now, as part of that determination, regulators may want to really understand what are the assumptions being made, or as we're doing bill calculations, what should we assume or what should we expect when it comes to enrollment on these rates? How many customers are going to enroll? How are we offering this rate out to them? Is it on a voluntary basis or a default basis? Because that's going to affect the enrollment rate, and we'll see that in a second. We also want to understand over time, if people volunteer for this thing or they're defaulted onto it, how long do they stick around for? Do they leave at some point? Do they leave in droves if they sort of feel like they were sold a rate design and that had adverse impacts on their bills, and then they all leave, en masse? We want to understand how they're going to change their consumption behavior. Because going back to the cost of service study, we have all these allocation factors around energy and demand, but are those under a different rate design? And if economic theory persists, and you'll see some examples where rates can get customers to change their consumption patterns, and we may want that even based on the rate design we're offering, well then what impacts does that load response have on revenue collection? And what does that do for under or over collection of the utility for that customer class. And last but not least, dependent on how customers react to these rates that are being introduced, what are the impacts on bills? And so these are all really key metrics that regulators, utilities, stakeholders are going to really want to try and better understand. So let's delve into those metrics a little bit more from a historical and experiential standpoint. Now, starting in the late 70s, utilities across the US began to add voluntary time of use rates to their tariff books, in particular to residential customers. Now, this was in response to the Public Utility Regulatory Policies Act, or PURPA. Now, despite widespread implementation over the last, 40 years, 50 years, I hate to say over 50 years because I was born in 1975 and birthday, I just turned 51. So it's been a long time. And despite that widespread implementation, the vast majority of these offerings have experienced very low enrollment rates. Okay, as of 2018, I know this is a little dated. I apologize. I did not have a chance to update this number. 84% of the utilities reporting data to EIA, the Energy Information Administration, had enrolled rates of less than 5% for all of their portfolio, for all of their portfolio of time-based rates, which are predominantly time of use rates. So why have enrollment rates been so low despite having 50 more years or more of experience with such rate offerings? I'm glad you asked. We know that many utilities across the US do not put as much time, resources, or effort into marketing and promoting their voluntary rates. Look, they're monopolies. They don't really need to sell anything, unlike a competitive market. The materials that they do develop, all too often, they're really not appealing to many customers, painting these kinds of rate offerings in a really negative light. I'm going to give you a series of quotes that literally came directly out of actual utility marketing material for time of use rates on either pricing pilots or full-fledged offerings during the 2010s. To not completely shame the utilities, I have left their names off, but nonetheless, let's start with the first quote. This program will not be beneficial for all customers contacted. Nothing that's sold by any company is going to be beneficial for all customers. Every product or service has its niche. So why is this TOU rate offering somehow any different? Why call this out so explicitly? Instead of focusing on the negatives, which is pretty general here, right? I haven't given any information as to who it's going to adversely affect, the conditions in which it would adversely affect. Why not focus more on the customers that it might be good for? Who are they? What are the conditions in which they could benefit? Well, let's take this one step further. This next statement is a lot more specific than the first one, but it still focuses on the negatives, right? And it categorically identifies a very large group of customers whom the rate may not be a good fit for. Now, let me be super clear. This was not based on any analysis or even an assessment of the empirical literature from a market research standpoint. It was rather developed based on the opinions and perceptions of the people in the utilities marketing department who developed this messaging campaign. I know this because I was part of the commission team that reviewed all this marketing material for a rate pilot and was able to ask questions of them. And this was one of the ones I asked, is this grounded in your own research or anyone else's research for that matter? And they said, no, this is what our marketing team came up with. The last statement, so does this sound like marketing material that's intended to promote the adoption of the rate or really try and shoo people away from it? And then this last statement seems, let's be, overly dramatic, all right? Suggesting the best way to avoid a shortage of electricity in the future is for you, the customer, to move on to this time of use rate. I'm not sure using scare tactics is necessarily the best way to motivate customers to take up time-based rates, but nonetheless, that's what this utility opted to do. So all in all, at least these utilities could substantially improve the quality of their messaging and marketing material that promotes their TOU rate offering. So what I hope you take away from this study, for those of you in the regulatory arena, is just because a utility puts one of these rates on its books doesn't mean it will necessarily develop good marketing material to bring a lot of customers in. And so what you might think about doing is make sure you have some ability to review that marketing material and provide some feedback in a quasi-public setting. I'm not looking for you to micromanage them and dot I's and cross T's and fix semicolons and things like that, but more just generally speaking, like, this is really negative. Why would anyone want to do this? You might want to come back with a much more positive message as just some simple feedback in an attempt to try and improve enrollment. Okay, there are also challenges associated with the utility's design of these rates. When looking at a lot of utility TOU designs from across the country, what we see are a lot of them that have incredibly long peak periods that happen to correspond with wholesale forward market power contracts. They run from 6 a.m. to 10 p.m. I will admit that is a little bit more on the commercial and industrial side than the residential sector side, but nonetheless, it's still true. Now, the choice of this peak period, it actually makes a lot of sense from one perspective. Historically, forward market contracts conveyed the best information about the marginal price to consume electricity. It was the economically efficient price to send to customers, and it was the only information that was really available to a lot of utilities from a marginal cost standpoint. However, within the last 20 years, a lot of utilities have joined organized wholesale markets that transparently publish day ahead, nodal LMPs. So it's really easy to get a better sense of what those marginal prices look like in that instance. For those utilities that are outside of organized wholesale markets, well, they themselves are running pretty sophisticated day ahead unit commitment algorithms. Those algorithms do have shadow prices as part of the constraints imposed on them that can be extracted to understand what those marginal prices could look like. So all of this is to say there's a lot more granular data that could be available to better inform the period definitions for TOU rates. Now, using this more granular data could be the foundation for implementing, like I said, more narrowly defined peak periods, which research shows customers prefer. The shorter is the peak period, more often than not, the more likely a residential customer is to enroll in that rate. Now, another critical design element of TOU rates is the ratio of prices between the peak and off-peak periods. Historically, many TOU rates had very modest price ratios that were less than 2 to 1. Again, given the length of the peak period, that doesn't really come as a big surprise. However, unlike the length of the peak period, these peak to off-peak price ratios do appear to be a main driver for customer disinterest. These do not appear to be a main cause of customer disinterest in TOU rates. The results of survey analysis at the Sacramento Municipal Utility District showed here on the slide that customers do not seem to have strong preferences for particular peak to off-peak price ratios, although they do modestly prefer lower price ratios to higher ones. So if the price ratio is not critical for enrollment, what might it actually be useful and what might it impact? Well, we know from years of research that the larger is the price ratio, the higher, generally speaking, is a customer's response to the higher price period. It's also the case that control technologies like programmable communicating thermostats, PCTs, help to increase the level of load response, potentially overcoming more limited response at lower peak to off-peak price ratios. Okay, so the other thing to really consider as one is looking at different types of rate designs is the enrollment approach. Residential customers have been historically asked to volunteer or opt in to time-based rates. Again, going back to PURPA, they were originally put out there as voluntary rate offerings. But with the introduction of smart meters and broader advanced metering infrastructure, the business cases that justified those investments typically included financial benefits associated with avoided costs due to widespread adoption and response, or enrollment and response, to the time-based rates that were now enabled by those smart interval meters. And so As a result, a handful of states have actually made time-based rates the default, where new customers have to opt out of that rate design. Now, some consumer advocates and others, which includes oftentimes utilities, have expressed myriad concerns about opt-out enrollment approaches in terms of how it exposes customers to time-based rates. This was especially true and really a cutting-edge issue back in the early 2010s. Coming out of the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act, the Smart Grid Investment Grant provided a lot of money to utilities to invest in advanced metering infrastructure. But the funding opportunity announcement associated with that attempted to tie that grant money to the introduction of pricing pilots, or really pricing experiments in this case. And so this was actually the first chance I had to meet Lisa. She and I worked together on that. I led that effort on behalf of 12 utilities. Lisa was one of the technical experts that worked very closely with those utilities. But what they were asked to do was run these various, very rigorous experiments around introducing pricing to residential customers under either opt-in or opt-out methods. It was the most robust and rigorous set of experiments that have been undertaken to date, although on some individual bases, we've seen some individual utilities do something similar, but this was the most comprehensive across the entire country. And so I'm going to give you some examples of results that came out of those pilots to hopefully better understand some implications associated with this enrollment approach. So first and foremost, let's look at different enrollment rates associated with those pilots. So the utilities that undertook these approaches had very different recruitment efforts. Some expended a lot of resources on market research. Others spent next to nothing on it. Some had very positive relationships with their customers. Others, sadly, had pretty toxic ones. And so there's a lot of factors that ultimately contribute to the variability in the recruitment rates that you see listed here. But it's clear if you just compare them, the highest opt-in enrollment rate that we saw across all of these pricing pilots was just shy of 40%, between 35 and 40%. The lowest enrollment rate when customers were defaulted onto these rates exceeded 85%. So huge differences in terms of enrollment rate, depending on whether folks are asked to volunteer or opt in versus they're defaulted onto it and therefore must opt out. Now, one of the biggest concerns that was raised, especially for the opt-out customers, was they're just getting put on this thing without really knowing what they're signing up for. And so as soon as they get a few billing cycles in, all of a sudden, they're going to notice that they're on this rate and they're all going to head for the doors. There was literally concerns about marching in the streets, an uprising on the part of customers because of them being defaulted onto this unbeknownst to them. And so the expectation was certainly substantially lower retention rates over time than when customers were asked to volunteer. Because in that case, they were effectively forced to, actively decide to take service under this pricing pilot and under the rate design associated with it, versus if they were defaulted onto it, well, there wasn't so much of an active choice as a passive one. But what we saw in reality is not substantially different levels of retention across all the different treatment arms, all across all the different studies that were being done. Yes, if you look at the opt-in, they were still most of those retention rates were higher than the opt-out case, but nonetheless, we can still see a number of opt-in retention rates that were actually lower than the associated opt-out retention rates. So all of this is to say, we didn't see that marching in the streets. We didn't see this en masse exodus from these rates as was at least initially reported, or concerns that were had. Okay, so the next thing folks raised as issues were, all right, well, if you volunteer for this, then again, you are making an active decision. You are at least notionally aware of that rate, and therefore you're going to respond accordingly to that rate. If you if you're defaulted onto it and therefore don't opt out, well, then maybe again, you took a very passive approach, really didn't pay attention to the rate as it was being given to you that you are now facing. And so you're not going to respond accordingly. And so if we look at the average customer's load response, depending on whether they were asked to volunteer, opt in, versus they were defaulted onto it, opt out, we do see that initial concern played out, where the level of load response on the average customer participating is certainly higher, over 2 times, almost 2 times higher for those who volunteered versus those who were defaulted onto it. There was a little bit of an attrition between year 1 and year 2 for the typical opt-in customer, which was not the case for the opt-out customer. So this is one of those instances where, the expectations came to pass and it was a reality. However, if our goal at a utility regulatory level is aggregate changes in the consumption of electricity by the class as a whole, then okay, yeah, maybe on an individual basis, we are having fewer lower load response, but there's twice as many customers, potentially, or 3 times as many customers is exposed to that rate. So even if each one is incrementally on average responding less, the whole notion that we have so many more of them responding might result in a larger aggregate response. And in fact, that is what ended up happening. So the Sacramento Municipal Utility District took the results from their opt-in and opt-out arms of their study, and then simulated what would happen if they offered to 100,000 customers the ability to voluntarily take service under the time of use rate that they organized, or sorry, on the right-hand side is the time of use rate, versus if they defaulted all of those customers onto it. And what you see is almost 3 times more peak demand savings, aggregate savings, when you default everybody onto it versus if you asked for volunteers. So this is pretty compelling evidence that if you're interested and mostly concerned about that aggregate effect, load response, then the way to get the biggest bang for your buck is to default everybody onto it. Now, that being said, there are definitely concerns about the fact that, look, in a voluntary environment, I, as a customer, am making an active decision. But in a default environment, that decision is, if I stay with it, it's largely a passive decision. I don't have to make a decision because I stick with it if I don't make a decision. So when we come, in this case, I'm looking at this, again, the Sacramento Municipal Utility District, comparing 2 arms of their study with basically the same rate design. In one case, the default enrollment achieved 98% enrollment. In the voluntary case, they only got 20% customers enrolled. But if we think about that default enrollment, it is likely comprised of customers who, if you had, instead of defaulted them on, asked them to volunteer, they would have done so anyway. And so we can now segment out that default enrollment, 98%, into 2 subcategories. The first are the ones that look just like the volunteers. They would have taken up service on this TOU rate, whether you defaulted them on it or you didn't, and you asked them to volunteer. So we labeled these folks the always takers. Nice fancy name for saying no matter what, they're always going to take service under the time of use rate. On the flip side, we know that under the voluntary and default enrollment approach, there were 2% of customers that said, no, thank you. I don't want to do this. Those we call never takers, and they are consistently expressing their preferences in both circumstances. And so the one group that we think might be at most risk when we think about defaulting customers on are those that make inconsistent decisions. Under a voluntary approach, they say no. Under a default approach, they say yes. And so it's that 78% of the complacents, as we call them, we really want to study them a whole lot more. And so we want to do it in the context of enrollment, retention. Well, we have enrollment here, but we want to understand retention. We might want to understand better load response, bill impacts, things like that. So I'm going to give you just a very quick synopsis of some of the analysis that we did to understand this. There was a whole lot more that we did in this space. Certainly happy to share it with all of you. But first, we know that the retention rates based on what we saw from the opt-in versus opt-out over time suggests that complacents remained at a higher rate than the always takers did. Okay, so this was really interesting that, those who were just happy to kind of go where they were placed, they didn't leave as much. Now, you might say, well, that's maybe because they actually didn't know what they were on. They didn't know the rate they were on, and so they didn't choose to leave, right? Alternatively, you could say, well, they were just, the cost of moving was too much for them, and so they stuck around with it. Both of those would suggest interventions we might want to do on behalf of those complacents. So in the first case, we might want to make sure that we are able to identify who those complacents are so we can better educate them, provide them with more information so that they make the right decision up front, but more importantly, they also make the right decision over time. Secondly, we may be wanting to provide them with, second thought was, we may need to make sure that they have certain protections after being on this rate if we want to bring down the barriers associated with allowing them to leave. So again, if they have high thresholds for wanting to take action, how can we reduce those barriers? Make it easier for them to opt out and leave if they want to. So that really comes to what is the utility's process for allowing people to leave, notifying them of that option exists, but also making that process as effortless as possible, right? I don't know about you, but I get really annoyed getting spam to my email, and oftentimes I will not go and unsubscribe if I have to do more than click a button. So perfect example of like my transaction cost threshold is pretty low. If it takes any amount of additional effort, like I will just suck it up and delete the darn things instead of trying to go out and figure out how to unenroll. So the other thing I want to share with you is also, what about load response vis-a-vis bill impacts? I find this slide to be utterly fascinating. So let me unpack this a little bit. What we see, not surprisingly, is that anybody who moves from a flat rate to some sort of time differentiated rate is going to inherently see a change in their bill, right? Because before it was just about, well, all of these customers have the exact same total usage of electricity over the course of the month, therefore they have the same bill. But when you move to a time-based rate, when you consume that electricity all of a sudden matters because you're either being exposed to the higher price or the lower price in a TOU rate example. And so the same customer, these customers with exactly identical bills under a flat rate may see very different bills under time of use. Some of them may see those bills going up, negative bill savings as a way of sort of looking at this graphic. I am consuming a lot more electricity during the expensive on-peak period. That price is in excess of the flat rate, and so obviously my bill will go up. Alternatively, you could be a customer who uses a lot of electricity in the cheaper off-peak period, in which case you would see your bill go down, or in the parlance of this graphic, you would see positive bill savings. And so inherently, you're going to see customers all over that positive to negative spectrum from a bill savings perspective. And so what I find the most interesting is that that's the x-axis. If we look at the y-axis is the level of response to those prices. And so what we see is this U shape for both always takers and complacents. So what that means is if you are seeing a bill increase, or the ones who see the biggest bill increase by simply moving from a flat rate to a time of use rate, they are the most responsive of any customers. And that's true of both our always takers and complacents. Now, you would say that makes perfect economic sense. They are seeing their bills go up. They are doing everything they can to try and mitigate those bill increases. So that one makes sense. What I find fascinating is, though, the other end of the spectrum. The biggest concern that is often raised when it comes to default time of use rate are free riders, meaning customers whose load profiles result in bill savings by simply shifting from a flat to a time of use rate. That has revenue collection implications, back to the whole allocation and cost of service study concept. And so the concern has always been those customers will do nothing and yet see their bills go down. What this analysis shows is that they don't do nothing. In fact, they are your second best responders, and that's true again for both always takers and complacents. And what's interesting is those folks in the middle, where I'm not really gaining a lot, but I'm not losing a lot when it comes to being on time of use versus being on, let's say, my old flat rate. And so that relative modest difference in bills is not enough to get those customers to really respond much. And so the question to ask from a policy standpoint is, should you do anything with those middle of the road customers? Because they are now facing a more economically efficient price, but they're not really responding. And so is that okay? Is that good from a policy standpoint? Are we okay with that? Similarly, on the extremes, how do you feel about that? If customers stand to lose a lot, meaning negative bill savings, their bills are going to be higher, can we target them regardless of whether they're always takers or complacents, and enable them to respond better by giving them dedicated tips, tricks, techniques for better managing their load? Similarly, on the other side, what can we do with those folks who are actually seeing bill savings? They're already responding in droves, so we don't have to worry as much about the notion of free ridership there as might have been originally articulated from a concern standpoint. Okay, so with that, just a quick overview, I know it was an hour and 10 minutes talking. So let me stop and let me turn things over to you all and see what questions you might have for me. CP, I appreciate your comment about complacence. Yeah, we were trying to come up with a pithy name that reflected that notion of, they don't make an active decision, they are passive. So complacence is where we ended up. Okay. So CP asking another question. Thank you. So now that we've done the Puerto Rico 100 report, what additional lessons learned would you share with others as a cautionary tale that Puerto Rico can provide for other utilities and regulators on rate making? Also, the PRED just accepted the Utilities Integrated Resource Plan, which feeds rate making. Maybe you can comment a bit on the role of IRPs and other planning processes. Great question, CP. Okay, so Puerto Rico. Puerto Rico, going back about 20 years, the utility began to make a series of bad decisions on their end, really not focusing on cost containment. Costs began to grow faster than revenues. And so utility went into the regulator and said, hey, costs are growing, we'd like a rate increase. Well, at some point, the utility was willing to go along with that, or the regulator was willing to go along with it. I guess in that case, there technically wasn't a regulator all the back when CP, but they were able to increase rates, I believe, by a board. But at some point, it was determined you can't keep increasing rates, and so we need to kind of hold rates steady. And yet the utility seemed to continue to see its costs rise. Then it began to use capital to fund operating expenses and inevitably found itself at a point where its debt burden was so egregious that it had to file bankruptcy. And so now, 10 years later, I think, roughly 8 years later, it is still attempting to come out of bankruptcy. And it is really limited the utility's ability to do anything because it can't access capital markets. Now, I know not every utility in the country is in that space for sure, but this notion of cost growth versus revenue growth and looking into the future with large loads, I think this is a very real issue. So it may not exactly be the lesson learned out of Puerto Rico, but I think the broader implications for rates and rate design over the next 5 years is how are the costs associated with interconnecting new data centers and the broader echoing effects of bringing all that large load on? How are you going to make sure that the bills are paid because rates accurately reflect the incurred costs, but you also ensure that you are allocating those costs appropriately? And so there isn't this perception or reality where people are being asked to pay for things that they didn't cause, because that is the fundamental notion of utility cost of service regulation. Is I should only pay for the costs that I am causing the utility to incur. So if in the PJM service territory, any utility in PJM service territory, you guys all know about RPM, the reliability pricing model, capacity market. Capacity market prices, went up eightfold between auctions, 2023, 24 versus the 2024, 2025, if I remember correctly. And the market monitor clearly identified the main driver, not the only driver, but the main driver of that are increases in the forecasted demand for electricity due to data centers. And so how do you take that bill that is owed to PJM in the capacity market and appropriately allocate that to data centers versus regular customers? How do you disentangle the increasing costs due to data center increased demand versus increase in changes in market rules versus changes in investment costs, right? So there is just some inherent challenges that I think are going to occur over the next 4 or 5 years that have echoes from that time in Puerto Rico, where it comes down to this notion of these are costs that the utilities are incurring. Are they costs that can be avoided? Are they costs that can be managed? And then if they are incurred, who is ultimately going to pay for it? On the planning side, planning ultimately dictates the future capital expenditures the utility incurs. So, active regulatory participation in any planning process, IRP being, obviously the one with the industry has the most experience in. But as Lisa mentioned, you guys are going to learn a lot more about distribution system planning. And I think the real importance that is beginning to play, because that is the cost category that is the single largest driver of retail rate increases over the last 5 years, I believe, 10 years, are distribution system costs. And so you all in the regulatory arena, how can you help manage those distribution costs, CapEx or OpEx? And that's where I think planning comes in. Okay. Arnell, anecdotally, it seems to me that many consumers areas across the US are seeing increased electricity rates and thus higher monthly bills. That is true. For consumers who dislike this and are energy burdened, what feasible methods of reaction could be pursued to try and reduce rates? It's a great question. So in the short run, right, you can create um, bill credit programs, other, payment option programs that really just deal with your absolutely most vulnerable customers. But if they are not being asked to pay their bill, well, again, at some point, someone has to pay the piper. So that could be a very, very short-term solution, but is by no means a medium to long-term solution. And so we have to begin to find ways to lower the utilities cost writ large. One option I know that is being considered, among others, in New Jersey is looking at performance-based regulation. Now, that is a multi-year activity to ultimately try and, move in a direction that really focuses the utility on performing in ways more consistent with the way regulators would want versus, let's say, the incentives inherent in cost of service regulation. But in a more short-term basis, could a regulator reduce, let's say, the authorized return on equity and make it closer to the derived cost of equity? That is a way to potentially lower rates, still allowing utilities to earn in excess of the cost of equity, which is going to still give them, and ensure access to capital markets, but isn't going to be you're not going to be super thrilled if you're the utility shareholder. So it really adversely affects current utility shareholders, but really nobody else. So those are just two ways in which I think the industry is beginning to think about this. I've seen that notion of lower ROEs begin to be discussed in a number of different states, in addition to this whole notion of cost allocation. And can you, introduce rules that better allocate those costs based on cost causation principles or beneficiary pays? Okay. Can we, CP, another question. Can you talk about what you're seeing within the industry related to AI data centers and those costs and how rate makers are trying to get ahead of the challenge? Rate makers move slowly, data centers are racing ahead, and are they talking past each other? CP, you got a bunch of really good questions. I always knew there was a reason I liked you. Thank you for coming today. So yeah, this is definitely an instance where I think regulators are just not able to move fast enough. And, I think some states out on the bleeding edge are being forced to deal with it. Others maybe are in reactive mode. But to your point, this is an industry that by and large has not changed dramatically since its inception 150 years ago, right? We've made incremental changes along the way. In my personal opinion, this is a real seed change moment where the growth in electricity is so beyond almost anything this industry has ever faced. You might say at the late 70s, we were in a somewhat similar instance, but I think it's just very extreme. And so I think to your point, what you are seeing is a big mismatch between the pace at which infrastructure can be put in to accommodate data centers relative to the speed in which data centers can come online. And so from a planning perspective, RPM is a perfect example of, I'm going to plan for what everybody told me are the data centers that are going to be coming online. That doesn't necessarily mean those utilities will actually be able to interconnect them, because even if they can get the transmission in place to physically connect them to the bulk power system, the transmission system may not be able to accommodate that additional demand. Similarly, there may not be enough generation to accommodate that. And so some of the things that I believe the reaction that you're beginning to see on the part of data centers is to move off the grid. And I think some states are beginning to seriously consider that as a viable option. So that very first slide I gave talked about the notion that monopoly utilities have an obligation to serve all customers. This may be an instance where we begin to really question that notion that utilities may just be in a position where, like, I cannot serve you, and so for you to do what you want, you're going to need to basically go off grid, which means they may need to become their own utility. And how does that work in an environment where, look, we have dedicated franchise rules? Utility is the only entity within this service territory that can sell electricity. But if you're a data center and you're told you can't interconnect, but as a federal policy, we really want you online, and the state might really want the economic benefits associated that come with that, then we may end up seeing the regulatory paradigm begin to shift and say, well, maybe we want to carve out that service territory in this limited instance and let that data center be its own utility and therefore be subject to the same kind of regulation that a utility is. But those are some of the things to me that there is a possibility of being highly transformational. But again, this industry moves relatively quickly, but this may just be an existential moment where there is an existential crisis. And so there may be these really big changes that are going to happen in some states, but maybe not necessarily in others. Okay. I was looking at BG&E Schedule RD, where the flat rate is around 17 cents compared to a roughly 36 on peak and 11-cent off peak under TOU. How does a utility determine these peak differentials? Are they primarily tied to marginal system cost, capacity obligations, and PJM peak exposure, or more to behavioral incentive designs? And how have residential customers responded compared to C&I customers in terms of adoption and bill impacts? So on the latter question, I think BG&E is obligated to file annual reports with the Maryland Public Service Commission under the PC 44 initiative. Don't quote me on that, but I think that's the case. So there may be some reported statistics around enrollment, adoption, and bills that could answer the second part of the question. The first part of the question is really getting back to that notion of art and science. So BG&E is going to use marginal cost information coming out of PJM to understand, where are the highest cost hours? Now, how do you define that, right? Is there some litmus test you use for, well, I want the top 5% highest hours to be included. I want consistently looking at across all days, all seasons, where am I typically seeing the highest price hours? There's also questions then around, let's say, PJM capacity market prices. Where do you put them, right? Do you make them part of the fixed cost per monthly, cost that utilities incur, charge customers? Do you put them into the on-peak period as a way to obviously increase that price, reflect the fact that customers are contributing during the peak to system capacity needs and therefore, affecting the outcomes of PJM's RPM? Those are all sort of subjective decisions the utility ultimately gets to make, and then has to, through its cost of service study, ultimately explain to regulators and others, where all those costs ultimately are being recovered. Distribution rates versus supply rates, et cetera. I mean, those are hopefully much more easily separated. But is the TOU rate, and I unfortunately don't remember enough. I think the TOU rate in BG&E is just the supply side. It's not on the distribution side. So there's sort of a flat rate for distribution system and distribution costs. And then I think the supply costs are where the TOU rate is. But again, I could very well be wrong on that. But again, it comes down to just the utility ultimately gets to make those decisions. They can certainly get input, through regulatory filings and, comment periods. The commission can certainly give them some direction in terms of what they'd like to see. But really, it does come down to the utility making determinations as to what makes the most sense to ultimately get that peak to off-peak price differential to some degree, again, cost-based, but also if I want customers to respond, well, then I need a narrower time window. I need a peak to off-peak price ratio that is meaningful and is going to get their attention. And so all of those things really ultimately go into the design decisions that the utility makes and that the regulator can ultimately kind of adjudicate on. Okay, 5 minutes left. This has been a great Q&A session. Um, any last questions before we go? I know there's only 15 of you left, for which I very much appreciate. Going once, going twice. Okay.
Thank you, Peter.
Hey, thank you, CP. I really appreciate all of you coming today. This will be recorded in case you want to get another bite of the apple and hear my sweet, sweet voice again, or you want to let others at your commission, energy office, etc., tribal council, learn more about rates, rate design, and the regulatory process. That'll be posted within the next couple of days, I believe, and you should be able to access it at that point. So with that, thank you all very much for your time. I really appreciate it. Keep up the good work. Doing God's work for sure in this fellows program. All the commissions, energy offices, and tribal offices are certainly the better for your efforts. And so I really thank you and applaud you. With that, have a great rest of your day. Really appreciate it.